A single ASML machine weighs 180 tons, needs 40 shipping containers to move, and takes 3 cargo planes just to leave the Netherlands. It costs more than $100 million, and it is built from over 100,000 parts, each one tuned to a precision smaller than an atom. For nearly 2 decades, exactly one company on Earth has known how to build this machine. Not 2 companies, not 3, 1. And in December of 2025, inside a guarded lab in Shenzhen, Chinese engineers switched on a version of their own. It should not have been possible for another decade, at least according to almost every expert who studies this industry. By the end of this video, you will understand exactly what that Shenzhen machine can do right now, what it still cannot do, and why the answer might decide who controls the future of every computer chip on the planet. If machines like this already sound like something you want to keep learning about, sticking around and hitting subscribe means you will not miss the next chapter of this race, because this story is moving fast, and pieces of it are still being written this year. To understand why this moment is such a big deal, you have to understand why nobody, anywhere, has managed to copy what ASML built. This is not like catching up on making a faster phone or a cheaper car. Extreme ultraviolet lithography, or EUV for short, is widely considered the single hardest manufacturing process human beings have ever industrialized. Japan tried to build something like it and stepped back. The United States funded government labs to crack it decades ago. China has poured billions of dollars into the effort for more than 10 years. All of them ran into the same wall over and over again in slightly different places. Here's the wall. To draw the tiny patterns that make a modern computer chip, you need light with an extremely short wavelength, about 13.5 nanometers. For comparison, a strand of human hair is about 70,000 nanometers wide. At that scale, ordinary light is far too clumsy, like trying to write your name with a paint roller. You need a beam so fine it can etch details thousands of times smaller than that hair, over and over, millions of times, without a single mistake anywhere along the way. The problem is that light this extreme does not behave like normal light. It gets absorbed by almost everything, including regular glass lenses and even the air itself. So the entire machine has to run inside a vacuum, using mirrors instead of lenses. Mirrors polished so precisely that if you scaled one up to the size of Germany, the tallest bump on its surface would still be less than 1 millimeter high. Building a light source powerful enough, mirrors flat enough, and control software tight enough to make this all work reliably at commercial speed took ASML and its partners more than 17 years and over 6 billion euros in research. Nobody else has finished that climb. Japan's Nikon and Canon, companies with decades of lens-making expertise behind them, both tried to build competing EUV systems and both eventually stepped back from the race, choosing to focus on older, less extreme technology instead. That is not a small detail. These were not amateur outfits. They were world-class optics companies with enormous resources, and they still walked away. Until now, maybe. This is also why almost no other company on Earth has even tried to compete directly. ASML did not build this machine by itself. It depends on a tight web of suppliers, including Zeiss in Germany for those atom flat mirrors and Trumpf in Germany for the high-powered lasers that vaporize the tin droplets. Losing any one link in that chain means the whole machine stops working, which is exactly why the technology has stayed locked inside one company's control for so long, instead of spreading the way most manufacturing knowledge eventually does. It also was not just one company working alone in a garage. ASML's breakthrough grew out of a public-private partnership that pulled in Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory, Sandia National Laboratories, and the Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory, 3 of America's top government research centers, all working alongside private engineers for years before a usable prototype existed. Even with that much brainpower in one place, early EUV machines shipped to test labs around 2006 were so slow and unreliable that they were commercially useless. It took another decade of grinding improvements and a rescue investment from Intel, TSMC, and Samsung buying a stake in ASML just to keep the research funded before the machines were finally good enough to sell. That is the mountain any new competitor has to climb. Not from scratch, exactly, but without a map and without permission to look at ASML's blueprints. So how do you even begin climbing a mountain like that in secret without access to the original designs? Picture it like this. Imagine trying to build a working jet engine from scratch without ever being allowed to look inside a real one, using only physics textbooks, and a small team of engineers who have never seen the finished product up close. That is roughly the scale of the challenge China's engineers have taken on, and the way they are attacking it breaks down into a few clear steps, each one a mountain of its own. Step 1 is making the light itself. Inside the machine, tiny droplets of molten tin, thousands of them every second, are blasted by a high-powered laser. Each hit vaporizes the droplet into a superheated plasma, and that plasma gives off a burst of extreme ultraviolet light. Think of it like a tiny controlled firework going off 50,000 times a second, and every single flash has to be almost identical to the last one, because even a slightly weaker flash throws off the whole pattern being drawn below it. Step 2 is collecting that light without losing it. Because EUV light gets soaked up by almost any material, the machine uses a specially coated mirror shaped like a bowl to gather the scattered light from each tiny explosion and focus it into a usable beam, similar to how a satellite dish gathers a weak signal from space and focuses it into something a receiver can actually use. Lose too much light here and the whole machine becomes too slow to be worth using in a real factory. Step 3 is steering that beam through a chain of more mirrors, each one reflecting the light at just the right angle, until it passes through a stencil called a mask. The mask carries the actual pattern of the chip's circuits, so the light passing through it is shaped into that exact design. The same basic idea as a slide projector throwing an image from a small transparency onto a big screen, except the screen here is a silicon wafer, and the image is smaller than a virus. Every mirror in that chain has to stay in near perfect alignment because a wobble measured in atoms is enough to blur the whole picture. Step 4 is printing that pattern onto the wafer itself, layer after layer, sometimes more than 100 layers stacked precisely on top of each other, each one thinner than a strand of DNA. If step 3 is projecting the picture, step 4 is making sure that picture lands in exactly the same spot, thousands of times, without so much as a fraction of a nanometer of drift. Get any one of these 4 steps even slightly wrong, and the chip underneath it simply will not work, and you have wasted an entire silicon wafer that costs real money to produce. There's a 5th challenge sitting underneath all 4 of those steps, and it rarely gets talked about, even though engineers consider it one of the most annoying parts of the whole process. That bowl-shaped mirror from step 2, the one collecting the light from the tin explosions, sits directly in the path of leftover tin debris every single time a droplet gets vaporized. Over time, that debris coats the mirror the way steam fogs up a bathroom mirror, except here the fog is metal, and it has to be cleaned or the mirror replaced on a regular schedule just to keep the machine running at full strength. Solving contamination like that at a small experimental scale is one thing. Solving it every single day for years, inside a factory that cannot afford downtime, is an entirely different and much harder problem. So where exactly does China stand on getting all 5 of these steps right at the same time, in the same room, on the same machine, day after day? Here is where the story gets specific, and where you can judge the progress for yourself instead of just taking anyone's word for it. According to reporting from Reuters in December of 2025, researchers working out of a high-security laboratory in Shenzhen have built a machine that is confirmed to generate extreme ultraviolet light and expose patterns onto test wafers, though it has not yet produced a fully working, sellable computer chip. Sources close to the effort compared the scale of the coordination involved to a Manhattan Project-style national push, with Huawei reportedly coordinating more than 3,000 researchers and engineers pulled from across the country. The division of labor is specific enough to sound almost like a national engineering relay race, and naming the runners matters because vague claims are easy to make, and specific ones are much easier to check later. The Harbin Institute of Technology has reportedly focused on the light source, the part that fires the laser at the tin droplets. The Changchun Institute of Optics and Fine Mechanics has worked on the optical systems, the mirrors that shape and steer the beam. Shanghai Microelectronics Equipment Group, known in the industry as SMEE, has handled overall integration, essentially assembling everyone else's pieces into a single working system. And SciCarrier, a state-backed firm out of Shenzhen with deep ties to Huawei, has been involved across the board, from lithography down to the deposition and etching equipment that surrounds it. Separately, in March of 2025, a research team at the Shanghai Institute of Optics and Fine Mechanics announced a breakthrough in laser-produced plasma. One of the trickiest physics problems in the whole chain, the same plasma step, described a moment ago as tiny controlled fireworks. Around the same period, researchers at Tsinghua University developed a new type of light-sensitive coating for the wafer, meant to be presented at an international lithography and patterning conference, aimed at making the final printing step more reliable and more efficient. These are not rumors floating around online forums or screenshots with no source attached. These are named institutions, named cities, and dated announcements, which is exactly the kind of detail that separates a real, funded engineering program from wishful thinking. Some earlier reporting adds even more texture to the timeline. Chinese media reported back in March of 2025 that Huawei was already testing a customized EUV setup at a factory in Dongguan, in Guangdong province, months before the Shenzhen lab story broke publicly. Whether that Dongguan work and the Shenzhen lab are the same program or 2 connected efforts is not entirely clear from public reporting, but the pattern is consistent: multiple cities, multiple institutions, and a timeline that stretches back further than most casual observers realized. Does that longer timeline change how surprising the Shenzhen announcement really was, or does it just confirm this had been building quietly for years? None of this is happening without serious money behind it either. In May of 2024, China set up the third phase of its National Integrated Circuit Industry Investment Fund, widely nicknamed the Big Fund, with registered capital of 344 billion yuan, roughly $47 billion, more than the first two phases combined. A chunk of that money, tens of billions of yuan in its first wave, was earmarked specifically for chip-making equipment and materials, the exact category that lithography tools fall into. So this is not a scrappy side project running on leftover budget. It is backed by one of the largest state investment funds in the history of the semiconductor industry, funneled through nearly 20 state-owned investors led by China's own finance ministry. This did not appear out of nowhere either. SMEE itself dates back years before any of this, originally built to serve China's chip industry with much simpler tools used for chip packaging, the less demanding back-end steps of manufacturing, rather than the razor-sharp front-end patterning EUV handles. In 2225, the packaging business was actually spun off into a separate company called AMES, which let SMEE narrow its focus entirely onto the harder front-end work, both DUV and EUV, instead of splitting its engineers across two very different missions. That kind of corporate restructuring rarely makes headlines, but it is often a much clearer signal of a serious, long-term push than any single press release, because companies do not reorganize themselves around a side project. Now, before this starts to sound like China simply has its own ASML sitting in a warehouse ready to ship, it is worth being honest about where the real working proof currently sits, because it is one level down from EUV, in a technology called deep ultraviolet lithography, or DUV. DUV is the older, less extreme cousin of EUV, good enough to make plenty of useful chips, just not the very latest ones found in the newest phones and AI processors. It is the technology equivalent of a reliable pickup truck sitting next to an experimental rocket engine. Both are impressive, but only one of them is proven on the road every single day. SMEE has already delivered its first batch of 28nm DUV lithography tools to Chinese chip factories, starting in late 2023. That number, 28 nanometers, roughly matches equipment that companies like ASML and Nikon were selling back in the mid-2010s. So it is not cutting edge by global standards, but it is real, it is running, and it is shipping into actual factories instead of just sitting in a demonstration hall. Separately, China's chip-making giant SMIC has been reported testing a 28nm domestic tool from a spun-off SMEE division called Yuliangsheng right on a real production line, not just in a university lab, which is a meaningfully bigger deal than a lab result, because production lines do not tolerate machines that only work sometimes. This DUV progress matters more than it might sound like at first, because even older lithography technology can produce surprisingly capable chips if you are clever and patient about it. Reaching a 7nm chip using only DUV machinery without any EUV step at all can take around 34 separate lithography passes layered on top of each other, compared to roughly 9 passes if you had EUV available. That is far more expensive, slower, and harder to keep defect-free, which is exactly why Chinese chipmakers like SMEE have been able to produce workable 7nm chips for products like Huawei's Mate 60 phone using only DUV tools, but have not been able to show any commercially produced 5nm chips as of the middle of 2026. DUV can get you partway up the mountain, it just costs a lot more sweat per step, and EUV is still the only realistic way to make that climb efficient. There's also a newer SMEE tool called the SSA 800, aimed at even more advanced mature node chips. And here the picture gets murkier, which is worth mentioning because an honest video does not just repeat every impressive sounding claim it comes across. In May of 2026, a Chinese industry outlet called ICS Smart publicly pushed back on online reports claiming the SSA 800 had already reached mass production with a yield of 90 to 95%, meaning the share of chips coming off the line that actually work correctly. ICS Smart said the machine really can process about 150 wafers an hour, a genuine and checkable number, but called the high yield claims far-fetched. So even inside China's own tech press, people are pumping the brakes on the most exciting sounding numbers, which honestly should make you trust the more grounded, boring sounding claims a little more, not less. Zoom out for a second, because this is bigger than one lab in Shenzhen or one disputed yield figure. Since 2019, the Dutch government, under heavy pressure from the United States, has completely blocked ASML from selling EUV machines to China. Not one has ever legally crossed the border. That single export rule has been the backbone of the entire American strategy to slow down China's most advanced chip industry, especially chips used for artificial intelligence and military technology. If China manages to build even a slow, imperfect, domestically made EUV machine that can reliably print working chips, that single choke point stops being a choke point. The rules of the entire global tech competition shift underneath everyone's feet at once. And the tension around this is not just theoretical anymore. In June of 2026, according to Bloomberg's reporting, the United States Commerce Secretary sat down with ASML's senior leadership in Washington and raised concerns that EUV technology, or components built for it, might have already leaked into China through some route. ASML pushed back hard, insisting it can account for the location of every single EUV machine it has ever built and shipped, all 314 of them, right down to the customer and the building. ASML's stock actually dipped on the news before recovering. Whether or not that particular accusation holds up, the fact that this conversation is happening at the highest levels of government, between a cabinet secretary and a corporate boardroom, tells you exactly how seriously people are taking China's progress right now. Beyond the geopolitics, think about what this means for ordinary technology sitting in your pocket. Every advanced chip that powers your phone, your laptop, and the AI tools you use every day depends on lithography like this. Right now, a huge share of the world's most advanced chips are made in Taiwan, largely because that is where the machines and the expertise are concentrated in one tight, hard-to-replicate cluster. Engineers inside that cluster have described their relationship with ASML almost like a marriage, working side by side for years to push each new generation of chips forward together, which is part of why the cluster is so hard for any outsider to break into, even with unlimited money. A working, independent Chinese lithography industry would not just be a national pride project. It would reshape who gets to build the next generation of smartphones, self-driving cars, and artificial intelligence systems, and it would hand China leverage in global trade and technology talks that it has genuinely never had before in this particular fight. That is the scale of what is actually riding on a machine in a lab in Shenzhen. It would also change the shape of the competition itself, not just who wins it. Right now, the entire advanced chip industry effectively depends on the safety and stability of one small island and one Dutch company's supply chain, which makes governments around the world nervous, regardless of which side of this race they are rooting for. A second, independent source of advanced lithography, even an imperfect one, would spread that risk out. That might sound like a purely technical detail, but ask any country that has watched a single shipping delay or a single factory fire threaten its entire supply of computer chips, and you will find they care about this kind of backup option more than almost anything else in the industry. But here's the honest part, the part a lot of flashier videos on this topic tend to skip entirely. Even by the most optimistic insider accounts reported by Reuters, sources inside the program consider 2030 a realistic target for actually producing working chips from this prototype. Not this year, not next year, and not even the year after. Some outside skeptics think it could take a decade or more beyond that. There's a wide, genuine gap between building something that produces extreme ultraviolet light in a lab and building something that can reliably make advanced chips at a cost factories are willing to pay. The performance numbers back up that caution pretty clearly. Reports on China's current EUV light source put its power output somewhere around 100 to 150 watts. ASML's light source hit 250 watts back in 2017, enough to produce roughly 125 wafers an hour, has been running at closer to 600 watts more recently, and the company has already announced research toward a 1,000 watt system for the future. More power generally means faster, cheaper chip production, so this gap is not just a small technical footnote. It directly affects whether a Chinese machine could ever compete on cost, not just whether it can exist at all in a lab setting. There is also a trust problem that has nothing to do with physics or wattage. For years, Chinese chip manufacturers have been quietly reluctant to use homegrown lithography equipment even when it existed on paper, because it was seen as good enough for demonstrations in academic papers, but not reliable enough to risk an entire production line on. One semiconductor executive was quoted describing earlier domestic machines as tested and approved mostly by academics rather than working factory engineers, and said no chip manufacturer had actually dared to run one on a real line. That kind of reputation does not disappear the moment a new machine works once in a lab. It takes years of stable, boring, repeatable success to earn the trust of factory managers who cannot afford a single bad batch of chips. And then there is the contamination problem from earlier in this video, the tin residue that slowly coats the light collecting mirror after every single flash. ASML solved that well enough to make the mirror last roughly a year between replacements and commercial machines, after nearly 2 decades of refinement. A brand new system, built in secret without that same depth of accumulated experience, has to solve that same slow, unglamorous wear and tear problem essentially from scratch. And problems like that rarely show up until a machine has been running for months, not days. It is the kind of challenge that does not make headlines, but quietly decides whether a machine that works once in a demonstration can actually work every day for a year straight. There is one more wrinkle worth sitting with before we wrap up, because it shows just how tangled this whole situation has become. Some of the same export controls that block EUV machines from reaching China have, over time, tightened around ASML's older DUV systems too. The very machines China still needs for mature node chips. That squeeze is part of what pushed China to chase a fully domestic answer in the first place, rather than simply waiting out the restrictions. In a strange way, the tighter the controls get, the stronger the incentive becomes to finish a program like the one in Shenzhen, which means this entire race is at least partly a story about how export rules meant to slow China down may also be the exact pressure accelerating its most ambitious attempt, yet to route around them completely. So where does that leave things right now, honestly, without the hype and without the doom either? China has built a machine that can generate extreme ultraviolet light and expose patterns onto wafers, a genuine milestone that most experts assumed was still years further away. It has not yet built a machine that can reliably produce sellable advanced computer chips, and by the program's own internal estimates, that moment is still years out, likely closer to 2030 than to tomorrow morning. The gap between a machine turning on and a machine working at industrial scale is exactly the gap ASML spent 17 years and 6 billion euros closing the first time. Closing that same gap a second time might be faster, with a working example somewhere in the world to learn from, but nothing about this history suggests it will be instant. What is different this time is the sheer size of the effort pushing toward it. Thousands of engineers, multiple national research institutes, a state fund worth tens of billions of dollars, and a level of public attention from governments on both sides that simply did not exist during earlier, quieter attempts. That combination does not guarantee success by any particular date, but it does make this the most serious run at the problem the world has seen since ASML itself first solved it. If you have made it this far, you clearly care about how this kind of technology actually gets built, not just the headlines about it. So tapping that like button and subscribing genuinely helps videos like this reach more people who feel the same way. And turning on notifications means you will catch the next update the moment there is real news to report, instead of more speculation. So here is the question worth sitting with. If China does hit a working, reliable EUV machine by 2030, do you think that changes the global chip industry overnight? Or does it take another decade after that before it actually threatens ASML's position? Drop your honest prediction in the comments below.